Hello and welcome back to the Argyle CFO Summit, Lessons Learned in 2022. My name is Michael with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. And to ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speaker, Matt Wright, Senior Vice President, Customer Success with Apzen. We're excited to have Matt for his thought leadership presentation titled, Defeat Legendary Enemies of Finance Automation with Artificial Intelligence. Matt, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome, and over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And good morning and good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're joining from. I'm joining from beautiful San Jose, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley at our Apzen headquarters office today. And thank you for joining me today to talk through some of the really persistent, we call them legendary enemies of finance automation, and how artificial intelligence represents one of the first real technologies to put a dent in the armor of some of these really persistent foes that our finance professionals have been facing for most of their careers. I'll start by just acknowledging, the series of enemies that we'll talk about today. The first being legacy tech limitations. Second being more around people, organizational and behavior change. Third being infrastructure complexities that we see in our finance operations that really lead to these massively intricate processes. And then kind of at the hub of all of this is the scale of work that we're performing as finance professionals every single day in the face of these enemies. So let's start by talking about legacy technology. And I think it's worth acknowledging that many of the organizations that we work with today, and some of you might be out there on this webinar today, fall on this spectrum somewhere. It's not out of the reality of today, where many organizations are still dealing with paper processes within finance operations. Some organizations have made the shift and moved to even keying from image, or have had some experimentation with optical character recognition or OCR. And even more organizations have worked and dabbled with RPA and rules-based automation. But given the maturity and the advances that we're seeing in artificial intelligence today, it's time to start calling RPA and rules-based technology legacy technology. Artificial intelligence really has reached the level of maturity and stability that finance leaders need to start embracing and implementing this technology in your environments. So we'll talk about the next enemy, which is the complex tech stack that most of our organizations are presented with in terms of the processing environment that we have to work with. Many organizations have endured and kind of contend with these environments for a number of different reasons. Many large organizations have grown through merger and acquisition, and these pieces of technology represent the landscape that they have to move transactions over. Other organizations have an appetite for really kind of best of breed solutions, which I believe, truly add tremendous amount of value, but create a lot of complexity in terms of moving data across disparate systems that don't talk well. So developing automation across this profile of a technology landscape in and of itself represents a challenge for many organizations. And when you have that many different systems that you're contending with across your enterprise, the processes that get evolved around implementing and moving transactions through those variety of systems, they get very complicated and very confusing for not only the users within your business, but also your suppliers that are trying to do business with you, for example. So this particular process represents a pretty common scenario that you would see in an AP invoice environment, where you have a process for your direct suppliers, another process for your indirect suppliers, in handling different types of inputs, whether it's paper or portal or some sort of electronic submission. And some of your suppliers are both indirect as well as direct suppliers, and they have different methods for invoicing depending on what type of product or service that they're sending to your business. So these natural evolutions of intricate processes are something that we've faced for many, many years in developing automation and trying to move transactions efficiently through here, while having the right level of automation paired with the proper amount of accounting controls to be sure that invoices are paid accurately, they're accounted for properly, and they're paid timely, are all really, really big obstacles for many organizations to work through. And we have the human element of making change in finance. The fact that you all have joined this webinar today, I would put you in the camp on the left side of my screen, where you guys are progress. You guys are trying to move the ball forward, and you're constantly being kind of resisted by the status quo, the quell of folks that just want to keep doing things the way they're being done. Or when you look at a different way of implementing a process, you're met with, yeah, but we can't do that because that's just not the way we do it here, right? So inevitably, moving the ball forward and achieving progress requires a significant amount of behavior change. So when we look at the scaling effect with the number of transactions that finance organizations are wrestling with on a day-to-day basis, this is a project that I think we could all relate to. I'll simulate a project where a large multinational buying organization has attempted to, or decided that the number of manual transactions that they're processing in their AP invoicing world is just too much to contend with. So they're going to go out and ask their highest volume suppliers to shift to a different method of invoicing. Maybe please send us your invoices to us in a CXML format. FTP, SFTP them in this specific format, and we'll consume them, and that'll deliver automation for us, right? And what happens is there's a pretty significant investment in the first year, where procurement, accounts payable, all of these folks that work with suppliers on a day-to-day basis, they work really hard to convert those biggest suppliers, and they make real meaningful achievement. You can see here in the first year, manual invoice volumes have gone down, automated volumes have gone up, right? And that feels good. But over time, as the business evolves and changes, we start to see the value that was created in the early phases of the project starting to slip back. And it continues to slip back over and over time. And the reason that this is slipping back is because of the constantly changing and dynamic inputs into the finance process. And that leads to project fatigue or value erosion over time, right? So when you start this process in the very first phase of the project, the day that you go live here, you will have implemented processing capabilities for your supply base as it exists on that day. You'll have different rules in place, different logic to resolve to vendor IDs. Maybe you have some logic in place to resolve to cost centers per supplier. And the day that you go in production, that system is optimized for your current supply base. But the day after you're in production, your supply base has changed, right? Some suppliers have dropped off. You've added new suppliers. And as time goes on, the inputs into your finance operation continue to evolve and change. You'll have new staff coming on board. Maybe you acquire a different business unit. Maybe your company is rolling out a new product. All of those changes, which are natural and healthy parts of your business, represent a delta in what you implemented in the very first phase of your AP invoicing project. And having to contend with those changes constantly over time just erodes the value and the efficiency of the program. So to attack these problems, we have to start to think about artificial intelligence as the biggest brain in the room. And what we mean by that is, so I'll confess, when artificial intelligence first, became mainstream and pretty popular 8 or 10 or 12 years ago, my first reaction when I heard artificial was I had kind of a negative reaction to it. To me, artificial means false, and false doesn't feel like it's the right thing to be applying to my business processes. The way I like to think of this actually is computer intelligence. And what we're seeing as computer intelligence or artificial intelligence advances is its capability to make very complex decisions with very high levels of accuracy and confidence. And we can see this all around us. The complexity of what we're trusting artificial intelligence to do is ever increasing, to the point where we're trusting artificial intelligence to allow a car to decide whether to move forward into an intersection or not. That's a complicated decision with very high consequences. And when we think about automating your finance processes, those are also very complicated decisions with very high consequences if they get them wrong. And the way that artificial intelligence is attacking these problems is primarily by using massive volumes of data. So when we think about what makes artificial intelligence hum, what is the magic of artificial intelligence? What it really is the consumption of historical transactions and the patterns associated with successfully completed transactions, and creating a library, a history of successfully performed transactions. And having that library available is what artificial intelligence draws upon to make the correct predictions. And the larger the library, the more patterns, the more complex the data set, the more sophisticated the models and the predictions can be to deliver more precise and accurate answers. And the way that we do that is we use massive amounts of processing power that wasn't available 8 or 10 years ago. Even if we had the data available to us to consume, we simply didn't have the computing power to take advantage of what we need to interrogate such a massive data set and look across all of those historical transactions to make an accurate prediction. And the way that we're leveraging and be able to harness this kind of processing power is by cloud computing. So the fact that we have cloud computing available, so we use a hosted cloud computing service, and we process massive amounts of volume and rely heavily on the processing power. And as our business grows, when we need more complete cloud computing power, it's not like the old days where we used to have to stand up a new server or stick a new blade into the rack, right? All we do now is we recognize that our bill went up. Our hosting provider simply charges us more for processing cycles. So for us as an artificial intelligence company, the ability to process massive amounts of data and harness limitless processing power really couldn't be achieved before cloud computing. So this is new technology that's allowed us to harness this massive computing power and solve really big complex problems. So if we just take an example of what that looks like for invoice capture as an example. So I'll focus on, a couple of, business transactions, whether it's invoices or expense reports. But in this case, we'll continue on the invoice track. So we have your suppliers that are submitting invoices in a variety of mediums. They could be XML, scanned paper invoices, or an email inbox. With an artificial intelligence capture approach to processing invoices, this engine it's agnostic to the types of mediums that are submitted to it. This isn't just a manual extraction solution. This is an accounting automation platform where we're consuming the data in all of the myriad of formats that come from your suppliers, and in any means that they choose to supply that invoice to you. And what we do is we start on the continuous feedback loop, which is the processing loop. So we start with document understanding, then we validate the data. And once the data is validated, we apply different accounting controls. So if it's a non-PO invoice, we have to figure out how to account for that. What GL account does that invoice get assigned to? What is the cost center that invoice gets assigned to? And using artificial intelligence, we're able to go back into that library of historical data sets with all of the transactions that we received. And we're able to look for a pattern within that library that matches the pattern that we're receiving now. And we're able to assign the coding, assign the accounting to that transaction based on the fact that a transaction just like it was processed the same way before. We use that same logic, that same routine to work on purchase order based invoices. So resolving the purchase order to the correct vendor ID, and then taking all of the lines of a multi-line invoice and matching them against all of the lines of a multi-line purchase order, and using artificial intelligence history to predict what those line matches should be. We do all of this without the intervention of a human when we're able to identify a pattern in history that we recognize matches with a high enough confidence to the transaction that we're processing right now at this time. If we're seeing a new pattern, if it's a pattern we haven't seen before, we'll seek some human input. We might need help if it's a brand new supplier that we've never seen before. There's really sometimes just heavy lifting involved in that first pass of the transaction. We need to feed the engine, right? We need to feed this continuous feedback loop. And the human will give us the answers that we need. They might need to do some research and some outreach. But what they're doing, I like to think, is not really processing that invoice in that outreach and identifying how to code that invoice. What they're really doing, in my mind, is they're investing in the future automation of another transaction like that. They're teaching the artificial intelligence engine, the next time you see this one, this is what you should do to it, right? And that's what the continuous feedback loop represents. So come back to this picture of complex infrastructure and really complicated processes and the reality of what it's like to try and make all of these systems talk together. And it's not enough to just move the data back and forth across these systems, because each system has a different data layout. There's different policies, there's different accounting rules for each of those systems. So it takes a lot of intelligence to marry all of this data up. And this is what artificial intelligence does. So the same invoicing problem, if you think about that going into that artificial intelligence engine, and then we have all of these integrations with the myriad of environments that your business relies upon every day to do business. And we consume all of that data into the artificial intelligence platform. Again, you're hearing me use a common theme here. We consume all of that data, and we store all of that data, and we don't store it in the way that a human thinks about, like recognizing a pattern. We store it with perfect clarity, right? So every invoice that we understand the data on, we understand it in perfect clarity. It's not as though a human, when I look at an invoice, I go, that's an invoice from IBM, and that other one is an invoice from Grainger. And I can see that pattern. With artificial intelligence, I know precisely every data element with perfect accuracy on each of those transactions. The same thing with the material master, your P2P environments, your vendor master. All of those environments are brought into one common processing platform with perfect clarity. So when we seek to marry data and identify patterns and link those patterns together, we're doing it with perfect fidelity that's only available with artificial intelligence. Again, the computing mind, given the processing power that we have available to us in cloud computing, is so much more powerful than what we've had to rely on as finance professionals up to this point, which is the human mind. So again, processing power is really how we harness artificial intelligence in a meaningful way. So let's come back to that timeline of all of these inputs changing, right? This is in my mind one of the biggest enemies of finance operations is if you can optimize a process that's rules-based, like I said earlier, in the beginning of a program, every day after you implement it, its value erodes. But the power of artificial intelligence is very different from that. So let me take this line and I flip it over. The inverse of these challenges, where you have a whole bunch of new suppliers that challenges your automation rate, well, it actually challenges the artificial intelligence rate initially too, right? So I'll be super transparent with you. When you introduce change to artificial intelligence, it has to learn how to process those transactions. So the autonomous rate will take a little bit of a dip while those new scenarios are being wrestled with artificial intelligence. And we're seeking some input from the human to help us with that. But the beauty of artificial intelligence, that's very different than rules-based technology, where rules-based technology has a continual nosedive. What you see with artificial intelligence is there dips, and then we rise again. We come out of the valley of learning, and we start to get another increase in autonomous rates, because now that we're getting used to those transactions, we're enhancing our history based on those new transaction sets and moving into a new world of being able to predict based on the fact that these are no longer new transactions. They actually are now in my library of history. I can begin to process those autonomously again. And I can't underscore this one enough. No human, no IT staff, no professional services firm from your vendor got involved to recover from that dip in autonomous processing. This is the power of artificial intelligence. The reality of finance operations is we will face change and we have to recover from that change. But previously we had to rely on tweaking technology to recover from change. Artificial intelligence has that built in, that learning element that allows it to recover from change every time it encounters change. So we get this trend line, even though we're dipping and diving all the way along over time, which is natural and healthy in finance. We have a trend line where our autonomous rate continues to climb. We don't have value erosion over time. We have value improvement over time because artificial intelligence is learning and getting better every single day that it's in production. So if we think about the outcomes that you can see, like, okay, this is all cool. Why everybody talks about artificial intelligence? I feel like I need artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, why do we put artificial intelligence in? We put it in because there's significant value for our operations, right? As finance professionals, we're constantly being challenged to perform the same level of work or more work with the same size team that we have today, as our business is constantly changing and growing and evolving. And artificial intelligence allows our teams to perform more transactions or automate more transactions much more accurately and not rely on the other stakeholders in the business, where if I get an invoice processed incorrectly, I have to go out to procurement and ask them, hey, what's the price on that purchase order? The supplier sent this invoice, the purchase order says another price. Can you, Mr. Procurement, fix that for me? Or if I'm running an expense report product and I need to rely on an auditor to tell me, is this an acceptable expense within my policy, right? So reducing the exceptions, because the confidence in our ability to predict the outcomes makes the efficiency much, much higher. And we can kind of increase the NPS score of the finance team by relying less on external stakeholders to help us process transactions. We can process more transactions for each one of our team members. The fact that artificial intelligence is confidently and accurately predicting the way that a transaction should be processed means we rely on those humans less and less. Now, I mentioned, you saw my slide, this will kind of go up and down as inputs change, but over time, we'll always be processing more and more transactions for each FTE that we have in our business. Improved visibility. The fact that we're using this massive cloud computing ability allows us to process transactions very, very quickly. So that invoice that arrives in your AP inbox, it's visible within an accrual report within minutes. And in historical accounting processes, if somebody was going really fast, that might be there in a day or two. In a lot of cases, it takes more than days, sometimes weeks, before an accountant can actually accrue or know what that liability is. With artificial intelligence and that cloud computing and high processing power and the ability to predict accurately, we can get that visibility down to minutes. So buying artificial intelligence is different than traditional technology. You need to experience the learning component of artificial intelligence. So we at AppSend, we have a free trial for each of our products, and it would be great if you wanted to hop in and take a look at our free trial for our expense audit product or our accounts payable automation product. So I have just a couple of minutes left, and maybe I'll take a look at the questions and see if I can answer a couple of questions that we received. So just scroll through here. So one of the questions is, how do you get buy-in from the AP clerk if they think they may be faced with job elimination? It's a really interesting question, right? I think most of us in finance organizations have plenty of work for our finance teams to be doing. And it's in most of the companies that I'm working with, they're not talking about eliminating the AP professional's job. They're looking at redeploying them into more value-added activities. A lot of our customers are using things like supplier portals, right? And we know that accounting professionals, AP professionals get right in the middle of supplier onboarding and driving adoption onto those portal products. So taking the work of the manual invoice transaction away from those folks frees them to add and do more of those value-added activities. Question I said, next question is, what do you do when a company is stuck in an old legacy approach? This is really another cool element of artificial intelligence. So in the old days, when we would want to implement a rules-based technology solution, we would have to spend a lot of time digging into the nuances of how that legacy, what the as is that we're moving away from, how that was built, and all of the intricacies of how to, write the right rules and build the right exception routines so that we know that the transactions coming through will process properly. So we do a lot of requirements gathering, write a lot of documentation, then write a lot of rules, and then test all of those rules. And then we go into production. There's a whole bunch of scenarios that we didn't think about that create new exceptions. And then we go back and keep and rework, right? With artificial intelligence, it's different. We don't have to gather all of those requirements. The primary informer of what the product should do and how transactions should be processed is history. So there's no longer this concern about, wow, my vendor master file is really, really messy. I have a ton of duplication, or I have this really old clunky system that moving away from would just be really scary. All we want to do is consume the history of your transactional processing and use that to inform us how the invoices will process in the future. And that's how we can automate without having to go through that really deep interrogation of how organizations are doing things today. Let's see if I have another question. Those are good ones. If AI made a mistake that resulted in an audit failure, who would be accountable for it? So the real virtue of artificial intelligence is that it is making predictions. But what's different than like OCR, where in the OCR days, a lot of us were burned by false positives, right? Where we thought it was an I, but it was really a 1, right? And the confidence levels were always how we got around that. With artificial intelligence, we're talking about a different level of confidence. The likelihood of artificial intelligence making a mistake is so much lower than any other technology, simply because we're using massive amounts of data that are all historical based transactions. Unlike OCR, which is using these complex algorithms, we're using history, right? So the ability for us to make a prediction and achieve a confidence score is much, much higher. Now, all that being said, we actually guarantee these transactions. So if we were to get a transaction wrong, we'll guarantee that. So that's our approach. And that's just a testament into what I just described a moment ago, which is the confidence in our ability to predict very, very accurately. So the next question, another good one, these are coming from Lindsay, what are the biggest challenges finance teams face when implementing AI initiatives? I think we're still in the mode where many organizations are afraid to trust artificial intelligence. It's a really natural concern, right? We can see this all over the place where technologists are pushing the envelope of what AI can do. But with our process, we allow you to feel it. We do proofs of concept. We have these free trials where you can actually see what the technology does in your own transaction set and gain the level of confidence. So overcoming that fear or that inability to trust, I think, is the #1 obstacle. And we think we have a pretty cool way around it. I think I'm at time, Michael. I'll turn it back to you and we'll wrap up.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was a wonderful presentation. We appreciate you. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today for this fantastic thought leadership. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.